Well, I see it's time to tell you another spine-tingling tale, eh, kiddos? Tonight's scary story is a true story. It's about a man who sees a huge glowing worm emerge from a grave in a cemetery. So sit back, tuck yourself in, and I'll begin. I call this one The Maggot.
One bright moonlight night in a small Yorkshire village, a postman named Mr. Mullins was on his way home. He was walking past the graveyard when something caught his attention. He noticed a luminous glowing light coming from one of the graves. It was a fresh grave of the villager by the name of Peters, who had recently died. When he looked closer, he realized that it was a large slimy blob that was crawling out of the grave, and it was wiggling back and forth as it emerged. It looked like a huge luminous maggot, and the ghastly thing seemed to be pure evil. With a mixture of horror and fascination, Mr. Mullins watched as the maggot slithered along the ground, leaving a gleaming trail of disgusting slime behind it, snaking in and around the tombstones. The monstrous thing crawled out of the graveyard, and when it came to a house nearby, it disappeared from sight. The following day, Mullins told his wife and his best friend about this chilling experience. That night, the three of them decided to go to the graveyard. They wanted to see if they could figure out what the hideous thing might be. And they waited and waited and waited, and just as it did the night before, the dreadful worm oozed from the Peters' grave and made its way out of the cemetery. As they watched, the thing crawled through the door of a nearby house. Again, it disappeared from sight. The next day, the Mullinses and their friend got a severe shock when they heard that the people in the nearby house had suddenly become ill. As the hours ticked by, their condition grew worse and worse, and by sunset, the entire family were dead. The doctors who examined them said they had died from tomaine poisoning. This type of poisoning is caused by exposure to a petrifying corpse. Mullins, his wife, and their friend were more determined than ever to get to the bottom of this horrible apparition's origin. And after dark that night, they ventured out once again to the village graveyard to keep watch. And again, the hideous maggot wiggled out of the grave and slithered between the tombstones, leaving a trail of slime behind. This time, as they followed it, they saw it go to the house of the village blacksmith. When it got to the front door, it suddenly vanished. The next morning, the village blacksmith and his whole family became ill. Just like the other house, they died before sunset of poisoning. Frightened and even more baffled than ever, the Mullins and his companions decided to keep watch again that night, but nothing happened. Although they were relieved, they decided to continue their nightly vigil at the graveyard for at least another week, just in case. 10 nights after it first appeared, Glowing Maggot emerged from the grave again and crawled out of the graveyard, and Mr. and Mrs. Mullins realized to their horror that it was going in the direction of their house. They followed it, and when the maggot got to the front door of their house, it disappeared. The couple were horrified when they ran into their house. Looking around, they found no trace of the maggot, and when they went upstairs, they found their 5-year-old son sleeping peaceful in his bed. The couple breathed a sign of relief and went back downstairs. The next morning, however, when Mullins and his wife tried to wake their son, they found he was extremely sick. The little boy was seized with a fit of vomiting, and within an hour, he was dead. Stricken with grief and anger, the Mullins and his wife wanted revenge. The grave of the maggot crawled out of was the grave of a man named Peters. After asking around, they found out in life he had been a mean, vicious man. He had made life miserable for his neighbors, and he had a particular dislike for both families. That night, they paid another visit to the grave, and this time, they were armed with shovels and gasoline. They dug up the grave of Mr. Peters, pulled out the coffin, and they cracked open the lid. Holding a lantern, they peered inside and saw the face of the corpse. Mr. Peters was grinning back at them. His body had not decayed at all, and there was a look of evil frozen on his twisted face. They took one look at him and slammed the lid down in horror, and after regaining their nerves, they dragged the coffin to a nearby field, threw back the lid, poured gasoline all over the corpse. Mullins struck a match and threw it on the corpse, which burst into flames. Mullins and his wife stood there watching the blaze until the coffin and the corpse inside were reduced to ashes. After scattering his remains with a shovel and sprinkling them with holy water, they returned to the grave and filled it in again. Although they kept a vigil for several days afterwards, the strange maggot of doom was never seen again.
The Mullinses and their friend really got themselves in a grave situation there, didn't they? I wonder what happened to the glowing maggot of doom. Maybe I'll search the cemetery tonight and see if I can find me a new pet. Hey, do you know what squirms and howls at a new moon? Wereworms! Well, that's all the time for this one. Remember to tune in next week for another episode. Until then, remember, kiddos, to stay spooky.